I remember being your age and, well, being a high school student and imagining my future and really having ideas about what I wanted to do next and what I wanted to study. But I really didn't have many connections with adults in the working world. And so it was hard for me to picture what my working life, my career might look like. So I think this is a great program and I'm really grateful to be included. So thanks for having me. So I will tell you guys a little bit about what I do and a little bit about my career path to date. And then I'll show you a few slides from a project I'm working on that I think um, illustrates a lot of the work that I do and the others that work with me at PCI, Pronouski Chatham, PCI for short. So yes, I'm a principal vegetation ecologist. The principal part just reflects the fact that I am part of a core group at the company that helps make sure the company runs smoothly, that we are healthy financially, and that we're taking good care of our staff people. And I lead the science team at PCI. We have 4 different teams: the science group, the planning group, the design group, and the construction group. And we're an ecological consulting firm, so all of our work is in the realm of natural resources science and assessment and planning for restoration. So I work currently, most of my work is in one of 2 realms. One is planning restoration projects, and they could range from looking at a open space area that has been badly damaged by bulldozers fighting a recent wildfire and trying to figure out how to reestablish sensitive vegetation on it, um, to working on a riparian area that's been degraded over time by overgrazing by cattle and figuring out how to restore that. And then on the other part of my work is really working with large conservation landowners like land trusts or the regional parks in Sonoma County and Marin County or open space districts. When they acquire a new property, I often work with them to help them understand what they have on that property, what the natural resources are, and where sensitive locations are, what could use restoration, and how to provide public access to places like that while still protecting natural resources. Um, as at PCI, we have a multidisciplinary team. So I'm the part of the science group. I've got a couple of other biologists that work with me, a wildlife biologist, and a couple of other plant ecologists. We also have a forester. And then our design team is landscape architects and civil engineers, and they all with a focus on restoration and native habitats. And our planning group is folks who are expert in understanding regulatory compliance and environmental analysis for projects. And then our construction team, we call it construction, but it's really implementing restoration. So it might be planting plants in a wildland setting and figuring out how to keep them alive. It might be taking down a small dam so that fish can pass through and restoring creek habitat. But those are the 4 groups at PCI, and we work closely together. So it's a lot of fun. It's challenging. As a consulting firm, we work project by project. So there's always a new property we're working on, a new watershed, a new client, and definitely keeps us on our toes. And I appreciate, though, that I have this group it's a close-knit group, and I always feel like I have someone to kind of reach out to if I'm stuck on a problem. There's always someone around to brainstorm with. And we do have our different perspectives. The perspective of me as a vegetation ecologist is different from a landscape architect, but we have overlapping goals and values and areas of expertise. So it's a lot of fun. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I got here to this point in my career. I grew up in Maryland, and where I lived, I had easy access to forests and creeks. I would spend all summer playing in the creeks as a kid and walked to school through oak woodlands every day, and just it was just part of the fabric of my childhood. And I loved it, and that was just it seemed normal to me to have access to that kind of open space. Um, and then when I was a teenager, I remember this one moment where I was on a walk and I encountered an area that had been cut down. The forest had been cleared for some office park development or something like that. And that moment just really has stuck with me because I was just so, I was so hurt. I felt so strongly about it. It was so painful to see. And it really just got me thinking, hey, this is a topic I'd really like to work on in the world. And so that began my process. I went to college and studied ecology. I went out to California to study at Stanford, and that was a fabulous experience. And while I was there, I started volunteering with a local nonprofit that had a restoration project on Stanford's lands. Stanford has 1,000 acres of open space next to campus, and the oak woodlands on it were declining. They weren't regenerating, mostly because probably the overgrazing by cattle and other changes that people had made to the environment just across California that made it harder for native oak trees to become established. So I started volunteering on that project and had a lot of fun there. That really introduced me to the idea that the human part of the equation is really an important place to focus when we want to affect change in the natural world. And the nonprofit that led this project, they were bringing volunteers from the community out, anyone from school kids to senior citizens to corporate groups. And they were planting trees and taking care of trees and monitoring and doing studies, but they were also really focused on getting people to know their local habitat, to start to see how people had affected it, and to just think more broadly about how our lives, our choices, our values affect the world around us. So that really kind of piqued my interest and has been a thread throughout my career, just a focus on the human side of the ecology equation. I ended up managing that project after I graduated from Stanford and worked on that for quite a few years. And then worked with the Center for Conservation Biology at Stanford, which was really fascinating. Lots of well-known ecologists work there and doing lots of forward-thinking research. And a lot of graduate students were there. And I started to think, do I want to pursue a PhD myself? And I really debated about it for quite a while. And my parents really thought that would be a great idea. but I decided I didn't. It was a very intense environment there. And that was not quite what I thought I was looking for in my life. And I also realized I really like the applied world of science, where I'm very interested in more basic science as well. But for my own work, I'm really inclined towards the applied realm, where you're taking scientific concepts and applying them to real world problems that are right there at hand. So shortly after that, I got married and had a baby and moved up to Sonoma County with my husband. This is where he's from. And at that time, after a year or so, I decided I would like to do a master's program at Sonoma State. And that was very applied. And that also I really enjoyed. Lots of interesting people doing great research there. And I studied vernal pools. I don't know if you guys know about vernal pools. They're kind of unique wetlands that occur here in Sonoma County and a few other places in the world, but they have unique plant and wildlife connected with them because they have this unusual um, regime of drying and filling with water over the course of the year. So I was studying those. There are endangered plants that are associated with them here on the Santa Rosa Plain, and land managers were really trying to figure out how to manage the non-native plants that were encroaching on these pools. And so I studied how we might be able to use livestock grazing to help meet that goal. So I really enjoyed that, and that led to consulting work on vernal pools. And that in turn led to my current job. So a friend of a friend just called me up and asked if I was interested in working with PCI. And that's definitely been a theme that in my career, one thing leads to another, one opportunity leads to another. And so that was in 2008, and I've been here since. And my work has definitely expanded from more small scale botanical efforts to larger property-wide or watershed-wide efforts, and also beyond the botanical to managing projects that have lots of different elements as part of them. So I'm really grateful that I've had all these opportunities to work in a realm that I'm really passionate about. And if I were going to give you guys any advice, it would be, I think, find a thread that you're passionate about or that you care about in the world, and follow that thread. And working hard and collaborating with lots of other people along the way, at least for me, has really led to lots of interesting opportunities. So why don't I go ahead and share some slides with you about one of the projects I'm working on currently. This is a project up in Gualala, on the boundary between Gualala and, or between Mendocino and Sonoma counties, with a small land trust called the Redwood Coast Land Conservancy. And it's called the Mill Bend site. It's a 113 acre site that they recently were able to acquire to protect it for conservation. And so PCI has been working with them to help get grant funding for the project and for developing a conservation plan that will, again, tell them what's on the site, look at the natural resources and other types of resources that are present to help them figure out what they need to do to take care of this site. Where is public access a good idea? Where are sensitive locations that need to be protected? And what are the restoration opportunities on the site? So it's a really beautiful site. It's right on the estuary, where the river meets the ocean here, which makes it a really rich environment ecologically. And it's also just beautiful. It has beautiful views. And because it's right next to the town of Gualala, and on the south side, right next to regional parks in Sonoma County, it's super accessible, and people are really excited to have access to this spot. So just before I dive in to describe our work there, just want to note that these are the kinds of partners that fund this kind of work. And so this particular project is funded by the California Natural Resource Agency, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and the Coastal Conservancy. All of those organizations, all those agencies are really excited to fund projects like this that are in the estuary. They have a lot of potential habitat for sensitive species like steelhead and coho salmon, and they're just really important for public access. So those agencies fund that kind of work. And then there's this whole suite of other local groups and state organizations that are involved too. It's definitely a team effort. So when we do a project like this, a conservation plan, we start by, of course, trying to understand the site itself and do a lot of background reading and review, database review. And this site has a lot of history. So it's called Mill Bend because it was the site of multiple lumber mills in this bend in the river. So if you know that area, you know there's lots of forest nearby, there's lots of redwood, lots of Doug fir. There's been lots of lumber activity in the region. And so you can see the site, this was in the 1950s, but it had been active as a lumber mill for a long time already. You can see it was clear cut and, graded flat and very developed and very highly altered at that point. So here is the site now. We're looking north towards the town of Gualala, and most of what you see there on the right side of the river is the preserve. So it's made a lot of recovery, but it's certainly not a pristine environment. So our next step on this project was to go out to the site. Our biologists, our landscape architects, we go out to the site and we visit all the different environments. We look at all the different plant habitats, all the different disturbed areas, and start to record our observations. We start to map things out. We look for areas that are sensitive, areas that might be maybe some of the disturbed areas, like that mill site over there, could be a good location for public access. We start to catalog what's out there. And here's just a view of the portion that I focused on initially, the plant communities out there. We describe each one of them and look for any rare species that could occur, like in the left-hand photo on the redwood forest. There are a few rare plants in there that we've discovered. And then we're also looking at areas that are problem areas that really could use restoration of some sort. You can see in that willow thickets image that, well, the willow thickets themselves are very dense and intact. The sandbar adjacent to them has been highly disturbed by unauthorized folks driving on the sandbar. So we're looking for management issues as well as sensitive resources. Our wildlife biologist goes out there and she's looking for signs of wildlife or their habitat, and also having done background research to give her a sense of what endangered species could be present. We know there are steelhead trout in the estuary. There might be coho salmon, it's unclear. There are red-legged frogs, another threatened species in a little pond on the site. And then there's just lots and lots of common but important wildlife species too. The estuary is amazing habitat for lots of bird life and other species like river otters. There are northern spotted owls nearby, and we know that their favorite prey is the dusky-footed wood rat, and there's tons of wood rat nests around the site. So she looks at all of those things and starts to think about what's most sensitive from a wildlife point of view. Then we come back in the office and we make a lot of maps. We use a lot of GIS in our work. I love maps, so I really enjoy this piece of it. This is just an example of how we might portray the sensitive areas on the site, and this makes it easier for the land trust and the regulating agencies to see, okay, where do they need to stay out of, what really needs special attention. That blue area with the purple circle, for instance, is that pond that supports red-legged frog. So having a visual representation just helps us start to lay out the project. Then, since I'm not just the ecologist on this project, but I'm also the project manager on it, I'm thinking about other types of considerations beyond ecology. So there are these remnant historic features that are present, mostly just traces, but they're still important to have in mind for protection. There's a cemetery, historic cemetery, that needs to be protected on site. And then there are other kinds of site constraints, like the fact that Highway 1 runs right through the middle of this preserve. It's that poses a challenge, obviously, for public access. We want to have people be able to enjoy both sides of the preserve, but it's not easy to get back and forth. There's no formal crossing right now. So that's another element we're looking at. And another consideration is that there are some disturbed soils from the past mill uses. There could be some contamination. We need to have that in mind when we locate different uses. Still more considerations that we have in mind. Climate change, flooding. So this is in the estuary, adjacent to the estuary. So it's natural that there's flooding on the site. The blue area shows where flooding happens regularly, roughly once a year. But of course, that's likely to increase as climate change proceeds, especially as storm surges become greater. Eventually, as sea level rise continues, that could also be an effect. And then there are other considerations just about site terrain and stability that are important when we're considering trail planning. So once we've got all that figured out, all the existing conditions figured out, we can turn our attention to the future, and we think about the restoration opportunities first of all, because this site really was protected for its ecological values. So we're working right now on plans for restoration of that main mill site, the remaining disturbed area that's got a lot of concrete and asphalt and lots of pampas grass and a whole suite of non-native species. So we're working on restoration plans for that, as well as looking at some of the other high priority upland areas. And then perhaps even more important on this site, we're looking at estuary habitat enhancement. So we're just in the beginning stages of this, but this slide shows some of the types of habitat elements that are important for salmonids that we'd like to see in an estuary. So estuaries are really valuable for young salmonids. It's a transition zone between freshwater and the marine environment, and it's a place where they grow and gain weight. So it's best if they have lots of opportunities for feeding and foraging. They need opportunities for cover so they can hide from predatory, from hawks or eagles or other predators. So deep pools with old fallen trees in them are really valuable. Log jams also provide cover, and they can provide respite from high flows. The wetlands that you often find along the estuary, they are really rich in insect life and provide lots of food for fish. So these are the kinds of habitat elements we'd like to see in the estuary, but there's not that much present in this spot. So our geomorphologist and wildlife biologist have looked out there, kayaked around, looking at where are some of those habitat elements. And these orange circles are just marking locations where they found some of those good elements, but there's not a lot. Much of the site is really open, relatively homogeneous and flat, and lacks the cover and the wetland environments that fish really need. So we're starting to think, what could be done out there? On the left is the existing conditions, photos, and on the right are some examples from other salmonid restoration projects. The upper right shows a place where an old side channel was reconnected with the river, and so wetlands could develop and provide that good rearing habitat. And on the lower right, there's a site where they installed big redwood root wads to provide some cover for fish. So those are possible elements that could be part of this project. So then, now that we have all the natural resources, both existing and potential in mind, then we're ready to turn attention to the public access. So we've worked with RCLC to think about their goals for the site. First and foremost, they need to protect the resources. Beyond that, they want to provide opportunities that are varied and really enjoyable for people. They want people to be able to experience the beauty and the ecological values of the site, and they want different ways of doing so, whether it's bird watching, or it's hiking, or it's kayaking, or using a wheelchair to access interesting locations. And the other piece, as I mentioned earlier, there are trails that are part of the California Coastal Trail, both to the north and the south of the site. So to the degree possible, they really like to link up with those. So those are their big goals for public access. So we've taken those. Our landscape architects have worked on coming up with concept designs for a couple of options for meeting those goals. And I am not going to show you all of those concepts. I can point you to them if you're interested afterwards. I'm just going to show you really briefly now, so we have plenty of time for discussion and questions and answers. But just in brief, we've come up with a lighter touch option and a slightly more developed option. All of the options are designed to be really resource sensitive. This image here is just a tiny snippet of the plan. There's too much to show you in full right now. But this one shows, this is the Mill Bend area itself. So that willow wetland area south of the highway. And there's an existing access road that people use for kayak access. But here we're proposing a short boardwalk that would let people explore this willow wetland area a little bit and have a place to sit and watch birds. But just a small boardwalk on an existing disturbed location. And it also shows the bright yellow line is a possible way to connect those California Coastal Trail pieces, but that would be outside of RCLC's property. That would be on Caltrans property. So that would be, it would be with Caltrans. Caltrans would have to lead the way, and that would be a long-term endeavor. It's not something that RCLC can accomplish on their own. So that's the lightest touch option for this area. And then this one shows a little bit more extensive option. So if you can see now, that boardwalk goes all the way up to the upper left corner of the image, and it would go beyond that to connect to the trail to the north. So a boardwalk would go all the way along the west side of the property, and it would link up to the bluff trail to the north. And it would also give people an opportunity to really experience the views and be further away from the highway as they're traveling north-south. So that would be, would have a lot of values from a user perspective, but it would also, it would come relatively close to that pond. It would take a lot more money, and it would have more impact on the willow wetlands, for instance. It would just mean that there was more human presence down in that relatively sensitive estuary environment. So that's just an example of the kinds of options that RCLC is considering, and we're helping them think about. These are the other elements now that we get down to. What are the specific impacts of any given option on the environment? What would they cost to build? What would they cost to take care of over time? How much does any given option rely on landowners outside of RCLC, like Caltrans? How resilient would it be to climate change and flooding? And how good a fit is it with RCLC's capacity? It's a, like I said, it's a small organization that has one part-time staff person and the rest is all volunteer. So they really need to think about how much they can take on and manage over time. So this is the stage we're in now on this project, helping our CLC think through these alternatives. And we'll be developing a portion of the public access designs further, and then writing up the entire conservation plan over this next 6 or 8 months or so. So that's just one example of our work that I'm really excited about. It's a good illustration of how my work begins with the vegetation, begins with the science, and the science is a theme throughout, but it also is really, really about people and working with people to help them find a way to align their interests and desires for land uses, help them align those with natural systems and natural processes. So it's not easy often, but I find it's a really interesting spot to work. So with that, I think I will stop the slideshow and give you guys a chance to ask some questions.
Question from Stefan. How can one incorporate habitat elements in the deprived estuary?
Yeah, good question. So first of all, I will say, of course, that supporting salmonids and their habitat is clearly something that needs to be looked at on a watershed-wide scale. So this is just one piece, but it's the piece that our CLC has control over. So possibilities are still being explored, but the types of things that we often do are reconnecting to side channels or wetlands off the main channel, where sometimes the shoreline has been built up. In this case, for instance, it's been built up in the Mill Bend area because they wanted to have a mill there. So they didn't want it to flood all the time. So they built it up. And so that means there's less access for fish, and the wetlands are changed. So fish can't go in there and get away from high flows. So there might be opportunities to reconnect some wetlands. There might be opportunities to bring in some large woody debris. So it seems a little crazy in some ways. We are bringing back the wood, the fallen trees that once used to accumulate in these estuaries, but all that wood was removed because it was valuable. It was valuable for timber, and it's been removed for other reasons as well. So there might be opportunities to bring back wood, large woody debris as well.
Sophia asks, where do you get native plants from to put into the areas to restore?
Another good question. We work with a number of different native plant nurseries, and it depends on the project. For more ecologically sensitive projects, we really do try to source plants from that location if possible, or at least their watershed. So where we can, we'll go out and we'll collect seed or other propagules, cuttings, or willow poles, or whatever it may be from the actual site. And then we can either sometimes directly plant them, or we can send them to a nursery to have them propagate or increase the seed. So we do that a lot. Sometimes we work just directly with the nursery if it's a less sensitive location. There are a number of nurseries throughout the Bay Area that we work with, and we just select the one that's typically closest to the project site. So that's, a combination of those things often happens.
Cameron asks, what challenges did you face when becoming an ecologist, and how did you overcome them?
That's a good question. I think that finding I think the biggest challenge is in the work itself. I feel like I've had a relatively smooth path just in terms of job opportunities and working opportunities. But the work itself is challenging, and that is it's balancing all of these different needs, all of these different constraints, and trying to find a way to meet them all. I like to think about the big picture and everybody's different interests. And I think that's part of my nature as an ecologist, but it's not always easy, not always possible to really meet all of the needs and interests in a particular situation. So I think that's just an ongoing challenge. And this public access relative to sensitive environments, or just public access relative to how much human presence we want to have on any given site and how it affects wildlife. That's an ongoing challenge in my mind, and finding that, you know, ideal balance. I don't feel like I've ever really finished studying that. So that's a challenge for me.
Carrie asks, what would you say the biggest problem you've had to solve in your career was?
Well, one problem I think of is that we were asked to revegetate up in Shasta County along a major river there, where PG&E had long ago built a hydroelectric facility. And in doing so, there was excavation along the river, and then they placed the spoils from that excavation. They had to make tunnels through the mountainsides, basically, to create this hydro facility. And then they took the broken rock that they created and just piled it along the river. That was, you know, 70 years ago, and that was the appropriate thing to do at the time. But these days, this is on Forest Service land, and they were required to revegetate those areas. And so we were brought in to do that. And revegetating a loose slope of a very steep rocky slope is not easy. Plants need soil, and they need a place to gain a foothold, and they need access to water. So that was a really challenging project, and really we made some creative approaches to how we installed plants and retained soil around them, and worked hard to just do a lot of plant irrigation and maintenance to get them through the establishment period. But it took a lot of creativity, and a number of people weighed in on that project. So we had to get help from multiple different disciplines to make that happen. So that was a tough one. It has been successful. I actually haven't visited it for a while, but we have gotten some native oaks and shrubs established on that slope. So there was success there.
Cool. Marcus and Angela ask, what is the most interesting ecosystem you have encountered?
Well, it's hard not to talk about vernal pools because I love them, and because that's kind of where I started. So I don't know if you guys have visited vernal pools or noticed them, but they're in the area between Sebastopol and Santa Rosa, the Santa Rosa Plain, and it extends north towards Windsor and down towards Rohnert Park. And like I said, there are these temporary pools that form, and people often don't know about them unless if you try to drive across the Santa Rosa Plain, like on Todd Road or something like that in the winter, you'll notice it's flooded. And that's because we've built in a place that used to be vernal pool habitat. And so once upon a time, that whole plain would fill up. It had small depressions all scattered throughout that plain, and they would fill with water in December or January as the rainfall began, and then they just gradually dry out as spring progresses. And so not that many plants and animals can really thrive in that kind of environment. So may have heard of California tiger salamander. They're one of the special status species that does only occur in settings like that. And then there's Sebastopol meadow foam, an endangered plant that doesn't occur anywhere else in the world, but in those pools in Sonoma County. So those are, I love vernal pools, and if you ever get a chance to visit them, I know the Laguna Foundation is offering some opportunities to visit vernal pools. It's a little past the ideal time for this year, but next winter, if you're curious, look them up and see if you can visit some vernal pools.
Mateo asks, do you often have to negotiate with people in your line of work?
Yes. There's a lot of places where we have different perspectives that we're trying to bring together. I think early in my career, I was more concerned about, more likely to encounter the situation where, for instance, I was doing an assessment of a property, and that was planned for maybe a new house, or maybe it was planned for a restoration project. And there was concern if we have any special status resources, that could make the project really hard. And I worried about encountering that situation. Generally, that was not a problem. Basically, I had the authority as a biologist to say, here's what is, and here's how you need to approach this particular resource. But I think more in my life right now, my work life right now, there is negotiation always. When there's a lot of gray zones where there's uncertainty about how likely something is to occur, or just how sensitive something is. So there is discussion, should we place this restored channel right here, or should it be placed there? One way might affect this adjacent wetland, or should it be farther from the wetland? So there's a lot of discussion back and forth, and between me and the landscape architects and the clients, trying to figure out what works. Every change we make to a project has follow-on effects that may be even more concerning than the original proposal. So there's definitely, I don't know if I would call it negotiation exactly, but there's a lot of back and forth discussion about what is the best approach here, for sure.
Kaylee asks, do you have to keep animals and bugs from eating the plants? And how do you do that?
Yes, we definitely do encounter that issue quite a bit. We have one project down outside of Yosemite that has a lot of herbivory challenges. It's on a river, and so it has beavers nearby, which we haven't encountered very much in Sonoma County, although they are around. So we were planting native riparian trees down there, and we had to protect them from beavers with cages. And then we also had to protect, as we often do, below ground from gophers. And again, we use cages for that. And then we often have to protect above ground for deer, and that's usually still more cages. So it's a lot of infrastructure to protect these plants. In nature, those plants would be regenerating much more abundantly, most likely. And so you wouldn't, the deer pressure or the beaver pressure wouldn't destroy a population. But because we're working in degraded environments, yes, for sure, there is pressure about that. Not so much, we don't have as much of an insect issue on our projects, but definitely deer, beavers, gophers for sure.
Aaliyah asks, have you seen a decrease in wildlife in areas where more people have access to the area?
Good question. I have not studied that myself. I feel like I have seen a decrease just over time in common wildlife, just anecdotally. And I know there are studies that have shown, maybe you've read them, that the number of wildlife individuals on the planet has really plummeted just since like the 1970s, which is really alarming and does kind of match with my anecdotal observations. Like I used to see more snakes and I'm just not seeing that many snakes anymore. But as far as in locations specifically relating to human activity, I haven't studied it, but we have done a lot of literature review on that topic because we do look at that. For example, when we were planning, working with regional parks to plan a trail where there was an important wildlife corridor for mountain lions and other species nearby. So we did a literature review at that point, and there is a lot of study out there, and it varies by species, but there is definitely some data that shows that wildlife absolutely change their habits and their patterns when humans are around. Sometimes they just shift their timing. They may become more nocturnal or crepuscular, meaning out in the very beginning or end of the day. But yes, definitely there's a lot of study out there, and it does show um, human presence affects wildlife.
Well, that's all the time we have for the recorded segment.